Hi class, I'm so happy to get started with our first video lecture of the semester. What you'll need to do before you watch each video lecture is first go over the chapter's assignment. In some videos I'll do that with you, so for this one we're going to go over the chapter 2 assignment before we get started, but some of the other videos I don't do that. So first, review the assignment just to know what questions are asked on your assignment so you know kind of what to look for as you're watching these videos. The second thing you'll need to do is have your PowerPoint pulled up while you're watching this, either on your computer or print it out. Just have it with you because there are blanks in the PowerPoint slides. So there are blanks that you'll need to fill in, and you'll fill those in by watching the video. Also, there are just kind of questions to answer, sentences to complete that I'll go over in the videos and that are in my version of the slides, which you'll see in the video. But the slides that you have access to, that's the student version. So those are what's posted on Blackboard. Like I said, those have some blanks in them, some ... dots where you answer the question, or just, getting more information. Because a lot of information that I say is not directly stated on the PowerPoint. So that's where you'll be able to take notes, write down just extra material that I say, just to increase your knowledge on that topic, just to learn more about certain theories and concepts that we'll go over. But this video is for Chapter 2, which is Bioenergetics and Aerobic Metabolism. Before we get started with the PowerPoint, let's look at your assignment. So here is your Chapter 2 assignment. For directions, the directions are the same for all the assignments. So the assignment must be typed in complete sentences. No listing or bullet points are allowed. And then answers cannot be copied directly from the slides. You have to put everything into your own words. So the first question here, we see they're short answer questions. All the assignments are only worth 10 points, and they all only have 5 questions. That means each question is worth 2 points. So your writing for each one should be a decent size. So if I were to space out kind of like this, your answer needs to be about this big or even larger. The way I grade assignments is basically by looking to see, did you grasp the information? Like, do you have enough detail to support your answers? Did you give me enough information to where you could explain it to somebody who's not in kinesiology? So someone who has no idea about this field, could you answer the questions and then that person would kind of understand it? So that's what I'm looking for. It's your ability to explain the material using as much information, as much detail as you can. So first question talks about the role of macronutrients, carbs, fats, and proteins, and how does that give us energy during exercise. Next one is the training adaptations that take place to the ATP-PC system. How do those adaptations enhance athletic performance? Next, you're just explain what you know about glycolysis and how the system produces ATP. So it's just basically taking what you learned and explaining glycolysis to somebody who's not a kinesiology major. Next is kind of continuing with glycolysis. So read question 4 so you don't explain that answer, and number 3. So you can kind of separate those. And then last is a critical thinking question. So this isn't just giving information. It's taking a concept and putting it into your own words, and then also explaining this using examples. So using examples of your own, using examples that I've given in class or in the lecture. So you're explaining, why can't we sprint indefinitely, which just means forever. So why can't we sprint forever? It's a pretty broad question, but what factors contribute to the inability to maintain high intensity activity for a long period of time? So yeah, those are your questions. So next we can just get started with the video lectures. Most of the lectures are split into 3 different parts. So this video here, I'll just cover part 1, and then you'll have 2 more videos for part 2 and part 3. Most of the lectures are like that, but some videos have 4 parts or 4 videos or 6 or 8, but most of them have like 3 to 4. So here we go. Okay, so chapter 2, just so you know, we skipped chapter 1 in the book. We just go straight to chapter 2. What is the purpose of this chapter? We're understanding bioenergetics. We'll define that term in just a second. And then anaerobic metabolic pathways, or anaerobic metabolism. First, we have to know the difference between anaerobic and aerobic. So anaerobic means without oxygen, and aerobic means with oxygen. And it's referring to how the body produces energy in a state or in an environment that lacks oxygen, which is this system right here, chapter 2. Chapter 3 is aerobic metabolism, which is an environment in the body where we do need oxygen present to generate ATP, which is energy. So here are our learning objectives. The first part, we're just understanding metabolic substrates. So carbs, proteins, fats, the characteristics of each one, and how they're needed to produce fuel during physical activity and exercise. And then next we'll get into the ATP-PC system, which is our first energy system. Then we'll get into glycolysis, which is the second energy system. And both of these systems are anaerobic, meaning they do not need oxygen to produce energy. And then lastly, we'll explain adaptations to both those systems, and then adaptations that the body experiences when performing anaerobic activity. So let's get started with part 1. You can see here energy sources and production. We're going to also mention or kind of go through types of reactions, and then a little bit about enzymes. So first, bioenergetics. Let's discuss what this term means. We see here the chemical process of converting food into energy. Another way to explain it is it's the flow of energy in a living system. And it's also just kind of referred to as metabolism. That's what we talk about more often. And what is metabolism? Metabolism is basically the total of all the chemical reactions that occur in the body and how quickly those reactions take place. Also, how efficiently the body uses substrates for energy. We talk about metabolism a lot, just kind of like in everyday conversation. We sometimes hear people say, oh, I have a really fast metabolism, or I have a really slow metabolism. But what does that actually mean? It's just referring to how quickly the reactions in our body take place to break down the food that we eat. So some people's bodies take longer to break down the food that they eat and turn that food into energy. That we use for exercise. Other people, so some people's are really slow, some people's processes take place really quickly, but it's just referring to how quickly those reactions occur. And that's what this picture right here shows. The food that we eat, so carbs, protein, and fat, we have to turn that into energy right here. And we'll learn about this process. And then we use ATP to produce heat, which is kind of a byproduct of all of the exercise and movement that we undergo. So let's learn about forms of energy. So we've probably heard of chemical, electrical, mechanical, but let's kind of define each one of these. So what is chemical energy? Chemical energy, it's energy stored in molecules or stored in food. So we see our carbs, protein, and fat here. There's energy stored in those molecules that we'll learn about. The next form is electrical energy, which this class does not talk about, but just so you know, that is charges. So like static electricity, current electricity. So yeah, again, that's not the purpose of this class. Next is heat. Heat is just energy that is explained by the movement of particles. And so you see here, we do produce heat when we exercise. And then mechanical energy is the sum of kinetic and potential energy. Kinetic energy is just motion. It's movement of the human body, muscle contraction, releasing heat as the byproduct. And then potential energy is energy that's possessed in a body. So it's energy that's stored and has the potential to be released. So based on those definitions that we just went over, here's a question right here. The body converts food into useful energy via what conversion? So normally some student would raise their hand and answer this question. But if you think about it, you probably got this right. The conversion it's the conversion of chemical energy into mechanical energy, which generates heat. So the food is the chemical energy, and the energy converts it into like movement, exercise. That's going to be mechanical energy. Via what conversion? So chemical to mechanical equals heat. So that's how that works. All right, next. Anyone familiar with the first law of thermodynamics? So this law it's actually pretty simple, and it relates directly to this class. So first law of thermodynamics basically says that the total energy in an isolated system is constant. It cannot be created or destroyed, rather transformed from one form to another without being depleted. This transfer of energy is the result of a series of chemical reactions. So instead of repeating that again, like I normally would if we were in class, you can, if you want to get that definition down, obviously you can just rewind this video and listen to it again. But it is important. So these two questions right here, you see these two question marks, you will see that either on the first quiz or the first exam. So this is just kind of an example of kind of listening to what I'm actually saying, writing this down. That's going to be important for answering future quiz and exam questions. Okay, so let's move on. This picture here is just kind of an example of energy production. So we see up here chemical energy and we have mechanical. We've already defined each one of those, but let's kind of give this example also of this process right here. So if you were just to look at this picture, you would know exactly what this is describing. This is describing photosynthesis. So solar energy is energy from the sun. It's about 1,000 watts per square meter of the Earth's surface. So that's how much energy the sun produces. And then plants will convert that energy in the sunlight into chemical energy. Chemical energy here, we know it's potential energy stored in chemical bonds in a substance. So it's stored as sugar and starches in the plants. In that process, like I said, photosynthesis. So it puts off the carbohydrate and it puts off oxygen. And then we use the energy when we eat plants and animals. So everything you see right here, these are all plants. And then we also know animal products stored energy as well. But yeah, so that's another example of the first law of thermodynamics. It's the transfer of energy. So the transfer of solar energy into this chemical energy here. So we know carbs, fats, and proteins. And then that's going to transfer into mechanical energy. When we consume these products, we're using that energy for muscular contraction. So yeah, just another really cool example of energy conversion in the body. Okay, so let's continue, let's get into the different types of reactions that occur in the body. So this term here, and I'll give you what this is, obviously. we're first going to talk about catabolic reactions. So what is a catabolic reaction? Breaking down substrates into molecules, releasing energy. This is also called an exergonic reaction. So it's the breakdown of, let's say, carbohydrates, which is referred to as glycogen, into usable energy during exercise. So that's one example. Or the breakdown of fat molecules to be used also in energy metabolism. Or the breakdown of protein into amino acids when, let's say, the body is depleted of fuel during exercise. The energy from a catabolic reaction is transformed into heat, which is energy, unless it's coupled to an anabolic reaction. And let's talk about that process now. So we have two pictures right here, and they each explain the same thing. They're just different ways to look at it. So we see here a catabolic pathway. So we have A, B, and C. So let's say that's the carb, protein, and fat that we consume. So we consume food, and it's going to undergo a catabolic reaction. So what happens with our catabolic reaction? So we see here we're breaking down those substrates, what we ate, into smaller molecules called cellular building blocks. That's going to release energy and release heat. So what I said earlier is that it's transformed into heat unless it's coupled with an anabolic reaction. So we see here one pathway is created or turns into heat. The other turned into energy. And then the energy is used to make an anabolic pathway or make an anabolic reaction. So what is this? Anabolic reaction is using energy to form a product from separate molecules. So we see over here, we're taking those cellular building blocks that were broken down in the catabolic pathway, and we take the energy that was produced and we use that energy in the anabolic pathway because it uses energy to make other products here. An anabolic action is also called endergonic. So an endergonic reaction is powered by ATP breakdown or ATP hydrolysis. So let's give an example of we're building something up. So we took small particles and we make larger particles or larger molecules. So an example is eating protein after resistance training. So we ate the protein. It was broken down into smaller pieces, but then we are building it back up to build our muscle tissue. So the protein is broken down into amino acids, but then those amino acids are going to combine together and form a macromolecule that's going to make our muscles larger. Or another one is osteoblast activation that adds growth and mineralization to bone. So let's say we consume calcium and vitamin D. So we consume that, and then the calcium and vitamin D is going to make a larger macromolecule and build up our bone tissue. So those are just kind of two examples there, and these reactions are really important to understand because this is really just how the body works. This is metabolism. So metabolism, when we consume food, all the food we eat undergoes a catabolic reaction. And then let's say we want to build up our muscle tissue or bone tissue or even fat tissue. All of that is anabolic reactions where we're taking something smaller and turning it into something larger. So I think I've given enough examples for you to kind of understand those two reactions. Just keep those in mind throughout this entire semester. I didn't go over this picture, but I did say exergonic is catabolic. So catabolic is the breaking down. We're using energy here to have an endergonic reaction, which is anabolic and form a larger molecule. But that gets us to our macronutrients. So one thing you do have to keep in mind when I go over the macronutrients is this is not a nutrition lecture. We are going over basic nutrition, but we're not going over any diets or recommendations on consuming these macronutrients. We're just going over the science of it. So just going over the facts. In your sports nutrition class, that is something that you will learn about, but this is going to be very basic information. Okay, so carbohydrates, they're composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And they give off 4 calories per gram of carb. So 4 calories of carbohydrate per gram. So it says up here, readily available or rapid, readily available source of energy. There are different types. Obviously, there's 3 forms of carbohydrates, and they all have a different amount of energy that's either slower or faster. So let's first talk about monosaccharides. So mono means one, and then saccharide means sugar. So single sugars, there are 3 types of single sugars. These monosaccharides are digested very quickly by the cells for rapid energy. So it gives a lot of energy in a really short time frame after consumption. So once you consume these monosaccharides, you get rapid energy to use for exercise. So first, let's talk about glucose. Glucose is just blood sugar. This is the primary energy source isolated in like sports drinks and candies. So glucose, blood sugar. And that's going to be the carb that we talk about throughout the rest of this lecture is glucose. Fructose is fruit sugar. So this is found in honey and in vegetables. It causes a less of an insulin spike than other sugars. So we know insulin is a hormone that moves sugar into the cells so the cells can use the sugar for energy. So fructose, less of an insulin spike. It's your fruit sugar. And then galactose is milk sugar. So this is found in your dairy products. Next is disaccharide. Now we have di meaning 2, so now we have 2 sugars. So these are also digested very quickly, but we only have to break apart 2 sugars into a usable form. So anytime we consume food, they're broken down into their smallest molecules. So if we consume a disaccharide, it's also rapidly digested because there's 2 sugars put together and the body just has to break apart 2 sugars. So it's also a very quick process. So maltose, that's beer sugar. It occurs during the fermentation process of alcohol and it adds that malty flavor to a lot of beers. Maltose, so that's beer sugar. Sucrose is table sugar. So basic table sugar. And then lactose is also milk sugar, but it's galactose plus glucose. So those are the 2 sugars added together. Wine is also, so I mentioned beer, wine is fructose plus glucose, and that equals a sucrose. So all these different sugars kind of in the normal everyday beverages that we consume. Next is polysaccharides. So poly meaning many. So this is 3 or more sugars. It can be 3 up to 100 sugars combined together. These have slower digestion to be broken down because we have 3 up to hundreds or thousands of sugars or saccharides added together. So starch. This is found in grains and plants like vegetables. It is digestible, but it's broken down into the monosaccharides before it's absorbed into the small intestine. So just like I mentioned, we have to break everything down into its original form. That's why these take longer to digest. Next is cellulose, which is our fiber. So this is made of like the plant cell wall. So the plant cell wall, it's not digestible. So cellulose, the body cannot absorb it. So that's our dietary fiber. It's not a source of energy, but it is helpful because it's the fiber. And then last is glycogen. This is the storage form of glucose found in our muscle and our liver. It's found in animal products and plant products. We'll be talking about glucose and glycose the rest of this lecture. Glucose and glycogen the rest of this lecture. But before we do that, here's a really neat flow chart for you to kind of follow. So first we have monosaccharides, and it shows you what those are. single sugars, and then we have our disaccharides, and it shows you the two sugars combined together. Our table sugar, sucrose, it's glucose and fructose, our dairy, lactose, and then our starch, maltose. And then we have complex carbs. So our polysaccharides, it just kind of shows you what those are as well. So a neat flow chart just for you to kind of keep everything separate and just to learn it all. All right, like I said, let's get into glucose and our glycogen. So first, glucose, we know it's our immediate source of energy. It's a single sugar. If we consume this in excess, it turns into the storage form in the liver or the muscle, which is glycogen. So glucose, we only need so much of it to be regulated kind of through our bloodstream, so as blood sugar. And what we don't use for energy, we store it. And we'll talk later about the liver storage and the muscle storage. But we see here storage form is a multi-branched polysaccharide of glucose, and it looks like this. So we see up here all the little red dots are glucose molecules. And then when you add them all together, it forms a large polysaccharide, which is glycogen. So stored in the liver or the muscle. So our liver glycogen, we see here short-term energy source when our blood glucose level drops. So this is what we use when we are not exercising. This is usually at rest. So let's say at rest, we haven't consumed food in, let's say, 4 or 6 hours or so. Our blood glucose level is going to drop. And so what happens, the liver is going to release its glycogen as glucose, or turn it into glucose, so we can use it for energy if our blood glucose level is too low. And then muscle glycogen, we use this during exercise in the muscles. So this is not used in the bloodstream. So readily available source of glucose in the muscle cells. So let's say I'm doing a lower body workout. Let's say I'm cycling. So cycling, lower body, my blood glucose level is dropping because I'm using that glucose for energy. Well, if that's the case, then my quadricep muscle is going to release its glycogen stores, and it's going to be turned into glucose, so now the body can use it for energy. So it's only in those muscle cells, not the bloodstream. The liver stores about 100 grams of glycogen, and the muscle stores about 400 grams of glycogen, and that's the muscle kind of throughout the entire body. But yeah, let's keep going on what are those terms to break down and form those sources. So first one we have is glycogenesis. So glyco meaning glycogen, genesis meaning formation. So how do you remember this term? One way to do that is Genesis is the first book in the Bible, and it means creation. So creation or formation. So when you add glyco in front of it, formation of glycogen from glucose molecules in the liver or the muscle. Glycogenesis is activated sometimes during long periods of rest when glucose and ATP are present in high amounts. So let's say we consume a large meal. We consume a large carbohydrate meal, and we have lots of glucose in our system. Well, we have to get that glucose out of the bloodstream, and we have to store it if we're not going to use it for exercise, if we're at rest. So that's over here. We see this first arrow, glycogenesis. We take all of this glucose and then we store it in the liver. So we can use it for later when our blood glucose level gets low again. And then next is glycogenolysis. Lysis means breakdown. So lysis is breakdown. Breakdown of muscle glycogen into glucose during exercise or when we are fasted and we need more energy. So this process would help to maintain blood sugar levels during exercise or at rest between meals when there's no glucose present. So just to kind of recap this, liver storage used to restore blood glucose levels when declining during like a fast between meals when blood sugar drops. The muscle storage is used to restore glucose levels in the muscle cells during exercise. We store about 15 grams per kilogram of body weight of that stored glycogen on average, but it varies by person and by diet. But yeah, that's kind of all we're going to talk about with carbohydrates. We mainly just want to understand glycogen and glucose, and then also the formation and breakdown of this. We'll talk more later about glucose and how we can make more glucose from other sources, but we'll get into that. But let's move on to fats. So fats are also called lipids. Lipid is the broad term. So if I say a fat or if I say a lipid, no, they're kind of the same thing. Lipid is just the larger class. These are an important source of fuel when metabolized because they yield a very large quantity of energy. They have about 9 kcals per gram of fat. So every gram of fat has about 9 calories. So here, we know they're in both plants and animals. So here's our plant fats and then our animal fats. Or, sorry, I said that backwards. Obviously, this is our animal fat right here, and obviously this is our plant fat. Okay, so we have different types of fats. A free fatty acid, it'll be referred to in this lecture as FFA sometime. So FFA, free fatty acids, different types. So we have saturated fats, which are solid at room temperature, which is going to be a lot of your animal fats, the visible fat that we can see. Unsaturated, we have 2 types of unsaturated, monounsaturated and polyunsaturated. Your monounsaturated are your omega-9s. These are very heart healthy. And then your polyunsaturated are your omega-3s and your omega-6s. These are going to be essential in the diet. And usually come from, the unsaturated come from usually your plant sources, and then also some seafood. And then next is triglycerides. So triglycerides is 1 glycerol molecule plus 3 of these fatty acids. So they're a larger structure. High levels in the blood is linked to atherosclerosis and coronary artery disease. So triglycerides are not necessarily good to have a high amount of. What is a glycerol molecule? It's basically a food sweetener or a food preserver. It's added to low-fat foods as well. It's actually sweeter than sugar. It's colorless and odorless. So when that's combined with 3 fatty acids, triglycerides kind of the storage form of it. But we'll talk about how do we break down triglycerides, and that'll be what we discuss on the next slide. So, storage form of free fatty acids in adipose cells and skeletal muscle are your triglycerides. So we store those. Stored in adipose, which is fat tissue. So an adipocyte is a fat cell, and then a myocyte is a muscle cell. So it's also stored in skeletal muscle. We break down our fats, though, for energy, and when we break them down, we do that by lipolysis. Lipolysis is the lysis, remember, that means breakdown, and then lipo, that means fat or lipid. So lipolysis, we'll talk later about, there's an enzyme involved in this, and I think we talk about it maybe in this lecture, maybe in the next one. But it's broken down by an enzyme called hormone-sensitive lipase. And yes, it is chapter 3 that we'll talk about lipase, which is the enzyme, and it breaks down free fatty acids to be metabolized for energy. But we'll talk about that later. Glycerol, when we split apart a triglyceride, that frees up the free fatty acids, the 3 of them, and then the glycerol molecule. Glycerol is interesting because it cannot be metabolized by the muscle. So the muscle actually can't use it for energy, but the liver can. So we send glycerol to the liver, and that's how we can make more glucose. We'll talk about this process later, but it's called gluconeogenesis. So Genesis, we already know that means formation. Neo means a new source or a non-carbohydrate source. And then gluco means we're going to make glucose. So gluconeogenesis is one example of gluconeogenesis is taking glycerol, sending it to the liver to make more glucose. So again, like I said, we'll talk more about this in chapter 3. But let's talk about how can we deplete fat? How can we use fat for energy? So exercise alone actually cannot deplete our fat stores. And we'll talk about in chapter 3 how the body prefers carbs instead of fat for fuel at really high intensities. So at high intensity exercise, fat is not the primary fuel source. Its carbs are the primary, or glucose and glycogen is the primary fuel source. We'll talk also about how we can use fat if there's no carbs present in the body, but the body actually really wants to use carbs. So that's why we can't deplete fat and we can't get rid of it by exercise. Fat is abundant even in our leanest individuals. So like these ultra marathon runners over here, let's say they're about 55 kilograms. They probably have about 12 to 15% body fat. And if you do the math with that, it's about 8 kilograms of body fat that's stored. So that's actually 17 pounds of fat, even in these lean individuals. And that's about 20,000 calories of fat that can be used for energy. But you can't use it for energy at high intensity exercise. So that's why it's still abundant. So therefore, it's impossible that fatigue depletion causes fatigue. Fat's the main fuel source at rest and at low intensities, but at moderate to high exercise, the body can't use fat and has to use carbs. So that concept will also be explained in more detail later in chapter 3. All right, let's move on to protein. So 20 amino acids compose of all proteins that we consume, all proteins in the body. So we know found in animals and then also found in plants. Only a small amount of protein is metabolized for energy. So we only use a very little bit of it. So if we don't use it for energy, there are some other things or other sources or other roles that protein has. But first, let me go back and explain what does amino acid actually mean. So amino means nitrogen containing. These amino acids are joined together in groups of dozens up to hundreds to form thousands of different protein structures in the body. Nitrogen is actually not found in carbs or fat, so nitrogen is unique to protein-only sources. So if protein is not really used for energy, then what are protein's main roles? Normally, I would have the class talk about this with your neighbor, and then we would discuss it together. But let me just go over it for you. So what are the roles? Contractile structure in muscle. So protein forms muscle tissue, and we'll learn about that in chapter 4. It's also involved in the growth of muscle and the repair of muscle with damage. So that's probably the main role is muscle building, muscle repair, and muscle integrity. And then it also helps to transport nutrients throughout the body. It helps transport hormones as well. And it does supply a little bit of energy in a fasted state. So when we don't have any other carbs are present in the body, then the body may turn to fat. May turn to protein, but we'll talk about that later. We have different types of amino acids, essential and non-essential. So essential must be consumed in the diet. We have 9 essential amino acids that cannot be made by the body, and it has to be consumed. And then we also have non-essential amino acids. We have 11 non-essential that are made by the body. So the body makes these. But 8 of those non-essential amino acids are called conditional, which means when we're sick or stressed or malnourished, the body actually cannot make those, making us possibly sicker. We have complete and incomplete proteins as well. Complete protein is usually going to be a higher quality protein that contains all the essential amino acids in a pattern similar to what the body needs. And those are going to be mostly of animal origin. And then we have incomplete proteins, which are just lower quality, and it means they're deficient in one or more essential amino acids. And those are going to be our plant-based. We also have branched chain amino acids, which, so your BCAAs, which are going to be your leucine, valine, and isoleucine. And those help to stimulate muscle protein synthesis, recovery, and growth. But all the essential amino acids work together, and that's going to be discussed more in sports nutrition. So I'm going to stop there with protein and stop there with all the macronutrients, because like I said, you will discuss that in sports nutrition class. You just have to know the basics of these macronutrients and explain them for number 1 on your assignment. So we just answered number 1. We've learned all about the macronutrients, and now you just have to describe them for me and explain how do they contribute to energy. And then I'm going to go over the protein part one more time. Protein is not the main source of energy. It's only used for energy if, let's say, we wake up in a fasted state and we go out not for like a 2-mile jog and not with basic resistance training. This is if we went out running fasted for possibly, let's say, 6 to 8 miles or 10 miles or more. Then maybe about 2 to 5% of your energy would come from protein. It's a very small amount. So don't think that we use protein when you haven't eaten breakfast and you do a workout. That's not necessarily the case. It's when we're in a very fasted state and the body still only uses a small percentage. A lot of people get that concept confused, and we don't discuss that concept until we get more. We don't discuss it more until we get to chapter 3. So you do what you can and answer that question for this chapter. But yeah, that kind of finishes talking about macronutrients. And normally we would do this in class where you talk about the exercise that you normally do. So think about the exercise that you did today or that you plan to do tomorrow. So what physical activity do you do? And then think about which macronutrient do you think is most important for your performance and then for your recovery. This question is going to be answered differently depending on if you do aerobic exercise or anaerobic. So if I resistance train, then the fuel source that's going to be most important, we already know that's going to be our carbohydrates. But we can train in a fasted state, but we would still pull from our glycogen stores and use glucose. But we also use ATP and creatine phosphate, which we haven't really talked about yet. But yeah, if I'm a runner, though, I'm definitely going to rely on carbohydrates. But if I'm a slow, long-distance runner, then my body's going to rely on fat and free fatty acids. Recovery, if I'm a long-distance runner, then the fuel source I need for recovery is probably going to be glucose. I need to replace the glycogen I just burned, and then also protein for the muscle breakdown. And then same with resistance training, protein to rebuild up your muscles, to heal your muscles, and then carbohydrates to give you that energy back. But yeah, just kind of think about it and think about what's going to be most important for you. But we're going to stop